All right. Hello, friends. There we go. I think we're good to go. Say hey in the chat. I'm checking it. It looks like everything's good to go. So if you're here, if you can see me, if you can hear me, say hello. Let me know you're here. It's always nice to know who's in the room, and then we get to chat a little bit. It is June 29th today. It is Monday, June 29th. Here in the Twin Cities, it is an extremely muggy day. It's extremely humid, and I am in my nice light Hawaiian shirt for the sake of the hot weather. There we go. Now I'm seeing people come in. Yay! There's Maddie, there's Carolyn, there's Ellis, there's Emmy, yay! And there's Julia, and there's Carson, and there's Titus. Oh my gosh, and there's and Mandy, okay. And Blankford, awesome. Good, I'm seeing all these people I know. Good to see you here, everybody. Yay, and hi Stephanie, and awesome. Everybody's just pouring on in, so I'm glad to see you all. Or see you in chat, see you pop up. And there's Melissa, yay. Melissa, I'm gonna try my darndest to remember this time that M-E is Melissa, is you. Hi everybody, I hope you're having a good night. I hope you're having a nice beginning to your week. Or if you're not, at least I hope you can do something to treat yourself, to get to hang out and do something nice for you. And maybe this is part of something that's nice for you. And if that's the case, I am so happy to be involved with this community. We're talking tonight about a story about callings, and we're talking a little bit about pride. It is usually, we just had the last weekend of June, and usually the last weekend of June is when all of the pride celebrations happen all over the country. So I've been thinking a lot about that, thinking about pride, thinking about celebrations of identity. And it seemed like, when I was kind of putting all this together, that it would be good to talk a little bit about pride and identity. And then when I started thinking about that, I was thinking about this word that we've talked about several times in the stories that we've read as part of our Bible studies. It's a Hebrew word that we find in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and the word is Hineni, which means here I am. And it's a word that I think about a lot when it comes to identity and understanding and calling, and it's in a lot of call stories in the Bible, so that's why it's come up so much. But thinking about that word, Hineni, here I am, I thought about the story where that word is probably used more times in one single story than in any other single story, and that is the story of the calling of Samuel. And so we're going to read that story tonight together and ask some questions about pride and identity and what this all means. So that's the plan. And I'm going to look especially sweaty as we get further into the night. I'm going to get sweatier and sweatier. I apologize. I have a fan on myself, but we'll see if that works. It can't be on the microphone, so that's always the trick. And there's Robin. Yay. Good to see you, Robin. So we are talking about, I'll put our little text up on the screen here. There we go. Tonight's text is 1 Samuel 3, 1 through 21. So it's the whole of the chapter of 1 Samuel 3. It's a chapter, but it's not like, as chapters go, it's like medium length. Like we're not gonna keel over trying to get through it. So don't worry about that. Let me move my camera here a little bit so that, there we go. So you can see the text a little better. Well, maybe against my Hawaiian shirt here. So that's the plan. So if you've got a Bible near you, pick it up and go to 1 Samuel chapter 3. And if you don't have a Bible near you, that is okay, because that's why the internet exists. Well, and for other things. But specifically, I'm going to put this in the stream here so that everybody can get a hold of the text if they want to. Oh, good. Titus says they love that story. Yay. Oh, no, Emmy's freezing. Emmy, I wish I had some of your AC. And yay, hi to Robin the cat. Good. So, yeah, grab your Bible, get to this story, 1 Samuel chapter 3. And as per usual, I'll be reading out of the New Revised Standard Version. But if you are reading out of a different translation, we are always excited and interested to learn about the differences in translation. So there might be times when I read a word and you're like, my translation says something that feels like weirdly different from that. If that's the case, bring it up in the chat and we'll try and talk about it and figure out why that translation is different. So that's the plan for tonight. So 1 Samuel chapter 3, I'm going to be reading from the NRSV. I think what we'll do is I'm going to, let's first talk about a little bit of background to this story before we get into reading. So the background to the story that we're about to read, two things you kind of have to know what's about to happen in this story. The first thing you have to know is that there's a woman named Hannah, and we meet her in the beginning of the book of Samuel. And Hannah has been praying for a child for a really long time. And she promises God that if God will give her a child, she will dedicate that child to the Lord. So there's this beautiful song that Hannah sings, and God grants her this child, and she has Samuel. And so then she dedicates Samuel to God's work by bringing Samuel to this temple and to putting him in the care of the priests there. So Samuel's going to grow up in the temple. So that's the first thing you have to know, is that there's this woman named Hannah, she has this boy named Samuel, and Samuel grows up being taught by these priests in the temple. That's thing number one. Thing number two is that you have to know that the priests that were in charge of the temple, there's the priest in charge of the temple at this particular place, his name is Eli, and he has been chosen by God. His sort of family lineage was chosen by God to be the priest there. The problem is that Eli has two sons. And Eli's two sons are not good people. They consistently take what isn't theirs. They end up spoiling sacrifices, and they end up, it says sleeping with women who are near the temple, but in the context, it's probably not a consensual thing. So Eli's sons are not good people. And so there's this problem. God kind of has this problem where God has said Eli and Eli's family are going to be the caretakers of the temple, and they're going to be like the main people, leading up the priesthood. But Eli's sons suck. And so God is kind of like, okay, well, so right before this story happens, God says, you know what, Eli, I've had enough of your sons. They're not going to inherit the priesthood, and they're going to die. And it's like a really hard thing for Eli to hear, because Eli himself is a good guy, but he's got two terrible sons. And God is like, you should have, basically I think God a little bit is mad at Eli for not stopping his sons and not sort of teaching his sons better, I guess. And so that's kind of where we're set up for this story, is that the priesthood, the line of priests, is kind of stuck because of these two terrible sons. And so Eli has been raising Samuel in the temple, and that's kind of where this story comes in. So that's the background you have to know before we get into this story. We're going to read the entire chapter here all in one go, and then we're going to kind of go back and go little by little. So if there are things, there aren't like good obvious breaking points. So I want to just read the whole chapter together, and then we're going to kind of take it bit by bit as we analyze and get into it a little bit more. So let's go ahead and read our way through this first chapter. And again, if you notice something that's different in your translation, that's like weirdly different, like there are going to be differences, but if you notice something that's like that doesn't seem like the same thing at all, let us know in the chat. So here we go. 1 Samuel chapter 3. Now the boy Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. At that time, Eli, whose eyesight had begun to grow dim so he could not see, was lying down in his room, and the lamp of God had not yet gone out. And Samuel was lying down in the temple of the Lord, where the ark of God was. Then the Lord called, "Samuel, Samuel," and he said, "Here I am," and ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, lie down again." So he went and lay down, and the Lord called again, "Samuel." Samuel got up and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." But he said, "I did not call, my son, lie down again." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he got up and he went to Eli and he said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood there, calling as before, Samuel, Samuel. And Samuel said, Speak, for your servant is listening. Then the Lord said to Samuel, See, I am about to do something in Israel that will make both ears of anyone who hears of it tingle. On the day I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew, because his sons were blaspheming God, and he did not restrain them. Therefore I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated by sacrifice or offering forever. Samuel lay there until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli, but Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he said, Here I am. Eli said, What was it that he told you? Do not hide it from me. May God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me, hide from me all of what he told you. So Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. Then he said, It is the Lord, let him do what seems good to him. As Samuel grew up, the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was a trustworthy prophet of the Lord. The Lord continued to appear at Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So, that's our story that we're looking at, and we're going to kind of go through it piece by piece here. This is a story that has some symbolism in it, some good symbolism to dig into. It's a story that has sort of a lot of action. It's, I think, one of the stories that we tell to kids a lot. It's like a good Bible school story because it's about a kid, right? It's about this kid Samuel, and this kid Samuel just like doesn't really know what's going on and has to have Eli explain it to him. But it's I think something that we tell to kids too, because we want kids to realize that like God can speak to you too. Like you're not too young for God to be active in your life. And so that's kind of one of the cool things about this story. So there's a lot going on. Let's start here. Let's just kind of take a look at the chunk of the text from verse 1 through verse 9. Okay, so this is like the first couple of times that Samuel is called, right? Is there anything that anybody noticed in that first part, verses 1 through 9, that you noticed different translation-wise? If so, plunk that in the chat whenever you feel like it, and we'll talk about it. A couple of sort of background things that it might be interesting to know about this part of the text. First of all, when it says in verse 3, the lamp of God had not yet gone out, what that's telling us, sort of literally, is that there's a lamp that's lit in the temple from sunset to sunrise, so it burns all night. So basically what that verse is telling us, where it says the lamp of God had not yet gone out, it basically means it was still nighttime, so it was before the sun came up. However, some people have kind of pointed out that maybe it was also a metaphor for like the sort of the acts of God had not yet completely gone away in the land. Like God was still active, but it was like a quiet thing, right? So we get that kind of from verse 1, right? The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Visions were not widespread. So there's this feeling of like, there's the centralized worship of God that happens at this temple in Shiloh. But things are kind of dimmed down. It's a time when God is not super active, and so that idea of like the lamp had not yet gone out might be kind of a metaphor for like what was going on with the people at the time. So that's kind of an interesting thing to know. So what do folks think about these first couple of times that God speaks to Samuel? Why, like, first of all, why is Samuel having such a hard time figuring this out? What do y'all think about Samuel in this moment? Is Samuel a relatable character? Is he... I think one of the questions that we kind of have to ask is, how old is Samuel? Because we're not really told, right? This story kind of hits different if Samuel is like 7 or if Samuel's like 14, right? Even at 14, I can understand having an experience like this. And I think adults can definitely relate to this story too. But I think the way that we imagine it is kind of different depending on how old Samuel is. So what do y'all think of Samuel, and how old do you imagine Samuel is in this story? So that's my first question I'm throwing out to you. Oh, interesting. So Julia's got a translation difference here. My Bible says the boy Samuel was ministering unto Yahweh or God rather than to Eli. That's interesting. Oh, yeah. So that's actually what mine says as well. The boy Samuel was ministering to God, the Lord, under Eli. So he's ministering. Yeah, what does it mean to be ministering to the Lord, right? So under Eli, right? Eli is kind of the one that's overseeing all of this. But when it says Samuel is ministering to the Lord under Eli, what does that mean? I'm wondering if folks, like, I have a possible answer, but I'm wondering what folks think that means. That Samuel, as a boy, is ministering to God. So Emmy says, my NASB study Bible is talking about how Samuel most likely hadn't had an experience with God yet, so he literally had no clue who was speaking to him. Making me think about how God can start calling people before they're even Christians. Definitely. Yeah, the idea here is that, like, that's part of the interesting thing about this story, right? Is that Samuel is growing up surrounded by priests, working in the temple, surely knows something about God, but it's this sense of, I think the thing that resonates with me is thinking of it as like Samuel had learned about God, but Samuel hadn't had an actual relational experience with God yet. So like that was like the knowing part. Samuel didn't yet know God because Samuel had learned about God and heard about God, but hadn't had an actual experience of meeting God. Yeah, so it makes sense in that context to think like, especially, and I think this is part of there's a callback, actually. So in verse 1, it tells us the word of the Lord was rare, and visions were not widespread. And then we're told again, there's a callback in verse 7. Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And so there's this sense that, like, not only did Samuel not know because Samuel hadn't met God yet, but also because other people weren't really hearing from God either, like, other than Eli. And Hannah, his mother, right? But he didn't grow up with his mother in the same way. So, like, maybe Samuel didn't even know that God did talk to people. He might not have known because there might not have been a good example around. Julia's using the Rotherham's Emphasized Bible. Interesting. I'm not familiar with that one. I'll have to look it up. Carolyn says, I imagine Samuel to be like 7 and he just learned to read. And I find it interesting that he thought that the voice of God was who would have been his main authority figure. Right. It's the kind of thing where I wonder who else Samuel could have gone to. Like, Eli is kind of referred to as sort of his main caretaker, but he's also like the head priest of this place. And so it seems a little bit like it seems likely that there would have been other sort of levels of people in between Samuel and Eli, but he goes to Eli, right? And he kind of thinks that that's who's calling. It makes me wonder what God's voice sounded like. Like maybe he was, like you were saying, Carolyn, responding to that sense of authority, and he connected authority with Eli. Or maybe God did sound like Eli. I don't know. Like, I wonder what God sounded like to Samuel in that moment. Oh yeah, Julia says I also use NRSV, Old King James, and the YLT. We talked about that last time too. So yeah, I think for Samuel, there's this this interesting situation where it's like the difference between sort of learning about something and actually knowing something or knowing somebody, and how that's different. So I'm trying to decide. I think sometimes when we do these texts, I kind of have us go through the whole text by itself, and then we try to make those connections to what's going on in the world at the end. But I think we can maybe start doing that like as we're reading through this story. So one of the things that caught me about Samuel's story, that connected me with this idea of like pride and identity, is a couple things. The here I am thing, which we're going to talk more about in a bit, but also the idea of meeting somebody being a giant like revelatory moment, and how that to me reminded me of the way that many of us can sort of hear about things or learn more about things, but until we actually meet somebody who embodies those things we've learned about, it doesn't become like real and relational to us. And that can be done in a number of different ways. Like one of the ways that I thought of it was like the studies that have been done over the past few years that show that people who know a trans person in real life tend to have a much better opinion of trans folks and tend to actually vote in favor of things that help trans people. So we know that knowing somebody who's trans changes people's understanding and their feelings about trans people in general, right? So I kind of thought about that when I was hearing this story of Samuel and thinking about the difference between like reading about something or having somebody tell you about somebody they know and actually knowing somebody, right? Because that seems to be what's going on with Samuel here, is that Samuel has heard about God, but now Samuel is meeting God, and that's changing everything for him. One of the things that I was looking in the New Interpreter's Bible commentary had an interesting commentary on this story, because they said, we often talk about this story as the calling of Samuel, but it doesn't follow the same narrative as most calling stories in the Bible. Like if you can think of other calling stories, right? Think of like when Moses has the interaction with the burning bush, right? And usually the way that an interaction, a calling like that goes is God says, hey, I've chosen you to do this thing. And then the person who's chosen goes, oh, I don't think I can do that. And then God's like, no, really, you can, I'll help you. and it's usually like a specific like a long-term type of thing, like they're called into a life of something. So like Moses is called to go tell Pharaoh to let my people go, right, and to release the Israelites. That's Moses' calling. Ezekiel is another example of this. Ezekiel is told that he's going to carry the word of the Lord, and Ezekiel's like, no, I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm like not ready to speak the word of the Lord. And God's like, no, I'll fix it for you. I'll help you. And so when we look at Samuel's call story, it doesn't look like that. There's not a moment of God saying, here's what you're going to do for the rest of your life, and then Samuel going, oh no, I'm not ready for that. So what this commentary I was reading, the point they were kind of making is that this is much more, it's a story that follows what we would call a theophany, an experience of somebody meeting God for the first time and just being like totally overwhelmed by it, and it changes their life. And so it's much more of a story of meeting God than it is a story of calling in reality. And so when we think of other stories of meeting God, you can think about Elijah, for instance. Elijah meets God on top of the mountain at one point and has this amazing experience where Elijah's like completely worn out, and God like reinvigorates him and shows him what he needs to see. And that experience of meeting with God changes things for him. So the story with Samuel, it's a moment of meeting somebody, and meeting somebody changes everything for you. So the other, one more sort of illustration of this is when I was looking for photos for the little thumbnail for our video today, I was looking at historic pride photos, like old black and white photos from like in the 60s and 70s of like really early LGBTQ plus moments in the US in like a visible, like a marching kind of way. And there were so many pictures of parents with signs that were saying things like, I love my gay kid, right? And I thought about that and thought about like, that's exactly what we're talking about here. That parent has met their kid and it's changed their entire vision of what it means to be gay, right? If you're the parent of a gay kid and you end up having like a positive relationship with that kid, you then have a more positive understanding of all gay folks because of that. So anyways, just another way that this kind of connects. Hi, Nikki. Yeah, I'm glad you're here. It's okay. We get here when we get here. That's the way this works. So, Samuel. I want to ask a couple of questions here about. You know what? Actually, I'm going to read a little section for you here out of a book that was helping make these connections for me. So I'm going to read you a tiny little segment. This is Elizabeth Erdman's book, Queer Virtue. Edmund, sorry, I always want to add an R in there. Elizabeth Erdman's book, Queer Virtue. What LGBTQ people know about life and love and how it can revitalize Christianity. Reverend Edmund is talking about, she has a chapter on pride, and she makes this connection with Hineni, which I was like, good, perfect. So let me read you this little section from this book about Here I Am. Some of the most prominent figures in Hebrew Scripture begin their work by giving voice to a healthy pride. They are people whom God calls by name. When they hear their names, these people sit bolt upright and respond with the Hebrew word Hineni, which means here I am. God calls out Abraham, and Abraham says, Hineni, here I am. God calls out from the burning bush, Moses, Moses, and Moses says, Hineni, here I am. God calls out to the child Samuel serving in Eli's temple, Samuel, and Samuel jumps up with a child's energy, ready for anything. Hineni, here I am. Hineni is a vital concept in Jewish theology. It's the prophetic response to God's call, a call that is issued to individual, vulnerable human beings. When God calls people by name, big things are about to happen. Abraham is about to prove his faith in God's promise. Moses is about to liberate the Hebrew people from slavery. Samuel is about to restore integrity to the priesthood and eventually will anoint David to be king of Israel. The person who says Hineni is basically saying two simple things. Yes, it's me, the one you're calling, and two, I'm right here. Hineni is thus a statement of identity and presence. That's why Hineni is a declaration of healthy pride. The person names themselves, declares themselves to be present. And all of that happens well before the person has a clear sense of what they're supposed to do. As we try to walk this path of queerly Christian virtue, our first step is to simply cultivate an awareness of ourselves while declaring ourselves present to God. We are essentially giving God someone to work with. So I just thought that little segment was so helpful in thinking about this idea of here I am. What does it mean to say here I am? And it made me also remember, of course, the classic Pride slogan, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, right? This idea of we're here, we are here, I am here, is so powerful. And it's one that we say every year, whether we're out in the streets or we're in our homes or over Zoom or whatever, saying, I am here, it is me. Like Reverend Edmund said, it says two things, right? Like, yes, it's me, and I am here. It says those two things. And so when we think about identity and what God is calling us to, or who God is calling us to be, that sense of I am here, here I am, can be a really, really great thing. Reverend Edmund talks about, just before that section I read, talks about how in Christianity, because pride is considered a sin, we have a lot of, there are a lot of Christians that are like, you can't be celebrating pride. Like, the understanding of what pride is so completely different within, the Christian sin context and the LGBT identity context. It's, such a different thing that we're kind of talking two different languages. But what does it mean to be, to ground in your identity and say, I am here, and then, like Reverend Edmund says, to give God somebody to work with? Right? And that's exactly what Samuel is doing in this particular story, is saying, yes, it's me, and here I am. What do I do now? And I think that sense of what do I do now is pretty relatable to a lot of us. So, let's see. Let's move down to, I want to ask you all another question. Let's see, which question should I ask you first? Here's a question. When Eli finally figures out what's going on, when Eli finally figures out that it's God that's calling Samuel, in verse 9, in verse 9, therefore Eli said to Samuel, go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now in verse 10 we hear, the Lord came and stood there calling as before, Samuel, Samuel, and Samuel said, speak, for your servant is listening. And you'll notice there's a word missing there, right? Samuel doesn't say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. He says, speak, for your servant is listening. And he totally skips over that Lord part. I wonder what you all make of that. Why does Samuel skip over that word? I think there's lots of different answers for this, but I wonder what you all think. Why does he do that? I can give you some of my thoughts, but I'm always interested to know what people think. That's a classic, the classic refrain as well. Eli clearly knows the stories. He knows the calling stories. And so he knows that like that would be the next right thing to say, is like, here I am. And then like, okay, what do you want? And it's a little bit like a phone conversation or like a scripted conversation that Eli's like, okay, this is what you say next. Ooh, 3 good answers right in a row. Okay, so Robin says maybe he was afraid of saying God's true name. So, yes, I think, Robin, you're onto something there for sure, that the name that in most English translations is just Lord, right? If you're, I think Julia has a translation that translates it to Yahweh, right? So the 4-letter name of God, which in Hebrew is Yod He Vav He, that's the 4-letter name of God. It's a sacred name, and you're not really supposed to say it or pronounce it, and you're not even supposed to write it in a lot of cases unless it's in like sacred documents. And so lots of people don't say it just to say it, and so it might have been that that maybe the young Samuel had never actually said the name of God before, and so wasn't really sure if that was the thing that he was supposed to do, even though Eli says to say it. So yeah, maybe he was afraid of saying God's true name. Carolyn says, I think that Samuel just didn't recognize God yet. Yeah, so it might be, and Stephanie goes right on top of that and says maybe Samuel is unsure it really was God. Yeah, so there's this sense that maybe Samuel is still not 100% convinced that Eli has it right. Because if you think about it, like, Eli did tell him, like, he might think, maybe he thinks Eli is kind of jerking him around. Like, he gets up 2-3 times to, like, go see what the matter is, and every time Eli's like, it wasn't me. And, like, maybe Samuel is not entirely convinced that it isn't Eli, and so he doesn't add a name to it. He's like, whoever is speaking, will you just tell me what to do? Which I like. Amanda says, I think Samuel is not sure his relationship to God or whose voice is speaking. Yeah, I think that was, that's an interesting point, that first bit you said, Amanda. Samuel might not be sure what his relationship is to God. So there's also a sort of a theoretical possibility that because Samuel hasn't actually met God yet, this sense of addressing God so formally when you're not really sure who God is, like, I can understand that. It'd be like somebody telling you, like, you go to you're going to meet a new person, and your friend you're going with is like, now you make sure you address him as my liege, and you're like, why would I do that? I don't know this person. I don't know, like, what their deal is. So yeah, there might be a sense of, like, not really being sure what that relationship is in terms of, like, God's who God is and what God's supposed to be doing. Titus says, I never assumed that was intentionally left out by Samuel. So that's another possible answer for this, is that it might be that Samuel is a scared 7-year-old kid who just doesn't remember what he was told to do, which I kind of like as an explanation for what's going on here. That maybe Samuel is just a kid who is totally confused and doesn't remember what's supposed to be going on. So I think that is entirely believable as well. So then the next thing that happens is that God comes before and says, Samuel, and Samuel says, speak, for your servant is listening. And then God says this really scary thing, right? This thing where God says, I'm basically gonna, he doesn't say, he says, I'm told him I'm about to punish his house forever. So he doesn't actually say to this kid Samuel that he's going to kill people. Like, he's going to kill Eli's sons. Eli's already been told that in a previous chapter of this story. But he doesn't say that to Samuel, which I appreciate. I appreciate that God doesn't say, Samuel, just so you know, I'm going to kill some people. Because that feels really traumatic for a kid to have to carry that sort of message. However, God does say, I'm going to do this thing. I'm going to punish this house forever for this iniquity. And then God says, the verse 14 is the really interesting one in this speech from God. God says, I swear by the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be expiated or wiped away by sacrifice or by offering forever. And that's the, like, big scary thing about this, is that it doesn't seem like there's a way out for Eli's sons. And in thinking about why this is the case, biblical scholars basically say the reason God says that, the reason God says this can't be fixed through like a sin offering or an offering to show regret, the reason for that is because Eli's sons were to themselves defiling all of the offerings and all of the sacrifices. So it was basically saying, your sons can't get out of this by doing the very thing that they were like screwing up before, essentially. So it's kind of a scary thing when you think about it. Like, you can imagine that Samuel was probably kind of scared, right? I think that, like, getting this kind of message, this isn't a happy message that Samuel is getting to carry to Eli. And also, Eli's like this figure who's a figure of authority, right? This figure who's helping to raise him. So you can imagine that it would be kind of a scary thing to hear. So, in verse 15, we get this line, Samuel lay there until morning, and then he opened the doors of the house of the Lord. Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. So, two things that are kind of pointed out in commentaries. One is that Samuel does lie there all night, and that, like, you can imagine this kid is kind of lying there going like, like being freaked out, right? But he gets up in the morning and he does his job, which is to open the doors of the temple. So he kind of, he's like scared, but he's still kind of doing what he's supposed to do. I want to talk about that moment of opening the doors of the temple in a second here. Ella says, Young's literal has unto the age instead of forever, which might hint that even this will be made right in the kingdom of heaven. Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder, I don't know what the Hebrew is for that moment. Let's see. For 14, 1 Samuel 3:14. Let's see what the Hebrew is on that. It is forever in Hebrew, like literally forever. Yeah, olam, which is a forever and ever, basically. But I like that, that there's a, like, I like that translation. I don't know if it's completely accurate, but the interesting thing about Hebrew, and I've talked about this before, so I won't go on a whole thing about it. But the interesting thing about Hebrew as a language is that it's a language with a relatively small vocabulary. And so one word has to be used for like a whole bunch of different things. Even though it does say forever in the Hebrew, forever doesn't always mean forever in Hebrew context. There are times when something is said to be forever and then it isn't. In fact, I believe that God originally promises that the line of Eli is going to go on forever, and that's clearly not a thing that's actually happening. So the word forever might just mean a very long time. So even though it's not, the literal could be more open than we think of generally when we think of a literal translation. But thanks for bringing that up, Ellis. So I want to think for a second about the imagery of Samuel opening up these doors in the morning. Samuel lay there till morning and he opens the doors of the house of the Lord. Now again, this could just be a moment that's telling us Samuel's a good Jewish boy who does what he's supposed to do. He does his job in the morning, even after such a scary experience. So that's maybe what it's telling us. But from the same folks that brought you the lamp of the Lord had not yet gone out means God's still active in the world, are bringing you another metaphor with this, which is with the opening of the doors, what could be signaled here is, I guess what we see before and after this story. Before this story, all of the worship of God is focused in on this temple, and it's all very, what's the word I want? Ritualistic, right? It's all about the sacrifices that are supposed to be made. It's about the things you're supposed to do happen in this place, right? And God only shows up near the ark. And the word of the Lord is not showing up in the rest of the land, right? So all of the activity of God is happening in this one small place. However, after this story, after the calling of Samuel and after Samuel grows up and becomes the prophetic leader of this community, the word of the Lord starts happening all over the place. So folks who are looking at this as a metaphor may say, Samuel is opening up the house of the Lord, opening up the doors of the house of the Lord. and God is getting out into the world, right? And this happens all the time in the Bible, that something will happen where people will have kind of confined God or God-type things to one particular area, and then God gets out and starts running amok all over the place. And that might be what's going on in this story, because God starts showing up in the world in a way that God had not prior to Samuel. So I kind of love the idea of this metaphor of Samuel opening up the doors of the house of the Lord so God can get out into the people again. Julia's wondering about a spelling thing. Here, let me send you this helpful thing here. I'll put it in the chat for folks that are wanting a free way to look at the Hebrew and what's going on. That's the interlinear for that particular verse. Olam is the way that you would pronounce that Hebrew word. And you can click that, actually. You can click the word olam there and see other places where it shows up. This is a helpful little translation tool. And then you can learn a little bit more about that particular word. So that might be helpful for folks that want to know more about it. Oh, Julia, I wonder if your particular, I bet what's going on here, because I'm seeing ion or eon, I'm wondering if perhaps your version is translated from the Septuagint, which is a Greek version of the Old Testament, because that to me looks more like Greek. And Greek was a long time ago in my schooling, but I'm wondering if maybe yours is a Septuagint translation rather than a Hebrew translation. Could be. So look up here. I'll put another link in the chat, just because this is all good information to know that there are many documents that came together into our English translations. So hold on. Let me. There we go. I'm going to put this in here as well, if you want to know more about the Septuagint. Yeah. So Amanda. Yeah, I would think awake, probably pondering what just happened. Right, so Amanda's talking about like why Samuel just lies there till the morning, right? It could be that Samuel is like not even ready to get up out of that space yet. And here's another thing I actually hadn't thought about, Amanda, so I'm glad that you brought this up, is when we have, like if you are somebody who's ever had kind of like a transcendent experience where you feel like you've met God in that moment in some way, you don't really want to leave that moment. You kind of like don't want to break the spell of that moment, right? So maybe what's going on with Samuel is not that he's like lying there chewing his fingernails being like, what am I going to tell Eli? Maybe he just wanted to stay in God's presence and like prolong that moment as long as possible until the morning. That could be too. So, got to get back to my text here. So then we kind of get the last part of the story. Samuel lay there till morning. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, but Samuel was afraid to tell the vision to Eli. But Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. He's using these like family words to sort of reassure Samuel, right? And then Samuel says the same thing, says, Hanani, here I am, right? So Samuel is showing up and saying, here I am. And I feel like it's in... I don't know, there's something about the way that Samuel is showing up to God and saying like, here I am, what do you need? And he's showing up in a similar way with Eli, but I feel like it would have been easier maybe for Samuel to not have been as open and vulnerable with Eli after this moment, because he has to tell Eli this bad news, right? He has to give this word from God that is not a great one for Eli. And so I don't know, there's something about saying here I am to Eli in this moment that to me feels very vulnerable and very brave for Samuel to show up and be like, okay, I'm still me, I've still got to be me, and I've got to tell the truth, and I got to do what God wanted me to do, even though it's really scary. So I just appreciate that. So then Eli says, what is it? And Samuel tells him, and then Eli says, let God do what seems good. And that's a tough thing I feel like that kind of underscores what a good guy Eli is in general, that Eli says like, you know what, this sucks, but like, I get it, or maybe not even I get it, just like, this is the way it's going to be, so what are you going to do? There we go. So yeah, I think this story, I kind of want to like talk a little bit more about how this connects to us and to our experiences as LGBTQ plus people. There are times when, I don't know, I can see this story as a metaphor for us in so many ways, but maybe before I like get into one that I feel like connects for me, I wonder how you all connect to Samuel. Does Samuel kind of, that sense of like saying, here I am, that sense of standing in your identity and standing in yourself and saying, here I am, both to God, to Eli, to other people, is there anything that connects you to this story or anything about this story that resonates to you as an LGBTQ plus identified person? I think something else that can maybe is another connection to this story for us is the constant naming of Samuel, right? The affirming of Samuel's name and responding to our names when they're called. And that doesn't always mean the names we're born with. So I don't know, naming I think is another big part of this. But I wonder, are there any parts of this story that we haven't talked about yet that resonate with you all? Whether you are gay or lesbian or trans or asexual or intersex or whoever you are, whatever your identity is there anything about this story that resonates with you that we haven't talked about yet? Because I'm sure there's plenty of stuff that I'm not seeing, because we can only see with our particular experiential lenses on. Julia, I'm not sure about your question in the Greek. Yeah, I'm not sure about the Greek for that, so I would have to look into that a little bit more. Melissa says, like Samuel, we might not recognize the voice of God and sometimes need others to suggest that God may be speaking to us. There's a danger in blindly, no pun intended, believing that, though. Yeah, I think that's a really great connection, Melissa, that like, especially as LGBTQ plus folks, if we have grown up being told that like we are wrong somehow, it might feel completely impossible that God would be working in our lives, like, or that God might be speaking to us, or that God might be active near us. Like, that may seem like something that we don't really know how to believe. And so to have somebody like Eli around to say like, no, for real, that's probably God. Say, what do you need? Yeah, that's really powerful. I love that, Melissa. The idea of like, who are our Elis in this story who could tell us like, hey, this is usually how this kind of story goes. Here's what you should try next to see if this works, you know? Yeah, but also always a little bit dangerous to blindly believe that God is speaking directly to you. We know that that doesn't always turn out well. So we have to, I think that speaks to the need of having other people around you, right, to help you figure this out and do that discernment work. Emmy says, I like how you explained how pride in the LGBTQ sense is saying, here I am, more than the negative boasting connotation the Christian world gives to pride. Yeah, agreed. It's hard. And I kind of loved the way that Reverend Edmund talked about here. Let's see if I can find it. Well, I really can't read it all. It's too long. But there's a lot that Reverend Edmund has to say about pride and how pride is different than the way that a lot of Christians understand it. So I would check this out if you're more interested. But yes, thank you, Emmy, for that. Melissa says, people who do not believe that God could be calling us into authenticity as transgender Christians might try to get us to think that God is telling us to abandon that call. Yeah, that's the thing is, like, I kind of wonder, I don't know, I wonder about, like, can you imagine what would have happened if Eli would have said, like, well, you're too young, God couldn't possibly be calling you, or you don't even know enough about God yet, God couldn't possibly be calling you, right? We could have Elis in our lives who are saying, well, you're trans, and God doesn't call trans people, so it can't be it, right? So yeah, I think maybe, part of it is on us to surround ourselves with people that can be speaking truth to us, but also some of it is believing and asking God to put those people in our lives, to believe that, like, the people who can speak truth to us, ask for those people to be placed in our paths because we need them. Julia says, having the courage to say, here, I'm here as I am. Yeah, that's incredibly, like, having, especially, like, if you imagine Samuel as a young kid, right? Having the power and the courage to say, here I am, this is me, period, is really powerful. Carolyn says, Samuel not knowing who called and trying to attribute the call to what it was supposed to be felt like staying in the closet or not having the words to describe your experience. Ooh, Carolyn, I love that connection, the idea of not having the words to describe your experience. That's something that I think has been true for a lot of us, like prior to coming out, either to ourselves or to others, thinking about like, if you don't know the words for what it is you're experiencing, how can you connect to other people? How can you explain it to anybody? And here, in this story, Samuel didn't have the words. Samuel was just like, somebody keeps calling me, and I don't know what's going on, right? I love that. I love that connection. Blankford says, the idea of saying, here I am, reminds me of John Wesley's covenant prayer. Oh, I'm not familiar. Let us know a little bit more about that. Hit us with a link or something so we can read more about it if we're interested. Amanda says, I think for me, I had this here I am moment after GCS. I broke down crying, and I had that here I am moment and like to hear God again. Aww. No, that's not TMI. I think that's powerful, right? That moment where you are, I mean, GCS is incredibly vulnerable, right? You're putting yourself in a vulnerable place. And I think God reaches us in those moments more than others because we've taken down, or some of our walls have been taken down for us, our walls, and so maybe God can get in those moments in ways that God couldn't usually. So that, I don't know, that resonates with me. Robin says, there's parallels with Samuel was asked to tell his message to Eli and how a parental figure may ask a child to come out to them. Ooh, interesting. Samuel was asked to come out with a message to Eli and how a parental figure may ask a child to come. Oh, I see, like in the way that Eli is asking, basically, where Eli is basically saying, like, tell me the whole story. I can see that. I wish all parental figures were as chill and supportive as Eli is. Titus says, what is GCS? Gender confirmation surgery. There we go. All right, y'all got it in the chat. Yeah, Robin, I that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that before. That like in that moment where Eli's like, tell me what's going on. You can see that a lot of times in parents that talk about how like they knew before their kid knew and they were just waiting for their kid to come out. I can see that a little bit. If only all all parents of queer kids were that affirming, right? That Eli just kind of says at the end, like, okay, this is what it is. Okay, so I want to throw out sort of one of my metaphors that connected with me on this. I didn't think about it until I got to that metaphor moment of Samuel opening up the doors. But like thinking about Samuel as this person who is called by God, who nobody expects is going to be called by God, who ends up breaking open the doors of an institution that has become a little bit off track and letting God out into the world, like that to me resonates hard with what queer Christians are doing right now. Like what queer and trans Christians are doing right now is we're saying, here we are, we're standing proud in our identities, saying, here I am, God, use me for what you want to use me for. And then we are opening the doors of churches in ways that the churches sometimes aren't ready for and aren't excited about, the idea of like power structures being taken apart a little bit. And we're opening the doors and letting God out into the world and letting breath into the church in a way that hasn't maybe happened in a while. And so to me, this idea of like Samuel as this queer kid who didn't expect to hear from God, who gets to hear from God and then opens up the doors for everybody else, that to me is like a really powerful metaphor and connection to like what queer and trans folks are doing for Christianity right now. We're people who are hearing from God, who are standing in our identity, who are saying, here I am, what do I do? And then we're opening the doors and we're messing with power structures and we are, being prophetic in ways that people never expected. So I don't know, that to me really connected this story and Pride to me. Nikki says, I think it took till my kiddo was 4 years old and saying, it's okay to be who I am because God made me this way, for me to see that. Yeah, even though I have been told my whole life that my sexuality was bad, that I truly am a child of God and I'm here as I'm supposed to be. Yeah, Nikki, I think like that thing that you're saying about like seeing it in your kid, like having your kid kind of change that for you, I think speaks to, actually, this might have been before you came in, so this is a great callback to what we were talking about before, that like knowing somebody, even if that person is your kid who's like years and years younger than you, knowing somebody changes things. Knowing God changes things. Having a sense of a relationship with somebody changes things. And so for you, it was like, well, of course, I've got this kid, God made them the way they are, and like God loves them, so like why wouldn't the same thing be true for me? That's a huge leap for us to make sometimes, but like that is an important, incredibly important leap. So I'm glad you brought that up. Ugh, I love it. So that's the story of Samuel's call. And like I said, it doesn't follow the usual call narrative, but it's a great one. I love it. This experience of meeting God in the unexpected and in unexpected ways to unexpected people is kind of God's whole shtick. So it fits in that way. So thank you all for coming tonight. It was really fun to get to talk. Thank you all for sharing your different connections to this story there at the end, especially. It was so good to hear from all those different perspectives that like things I'd never thought of before. We've all got stuff that we bring to Scripture and things that we can see that other people can't see. And it's great. I love it. Julia, I'll be honest with you, I might not remember because I have like a million emails right now, but if you could email me, I will then email you back because then it will be in my inbox and I will for sure see it. Oh, good, and Ellis has another resource there as well. So the last thing is I'm going to put our calendar in the chat so that everybody can see it, so you can see when things are happening. There we go. If you want to see what's going on with TMC, we've got support groups happening tomorrow afternoon and then on Thursday night. So those are our things coming up the rest of this week, and you can check that calendar that I just put in the chat to see what else is happening. Yeah, we're doing a lot of things all the time. That's kind of our thing too. So we'll hopefully talk to you again soon. We'll have another Bible study in 2 weeks, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your night. Stay safe, everybody, and keep saying, here I am. Keep being proud. All right, bye.